Hartwell name had once meant something in London. That was the phrase Lady Victoria Hartwell used most often, delivered in the particular tone of a woman who had mistaken her own nostalgia for fact. The name had once meant something. It had appeared on invitation lists and in the pages of society columns and on the lips of hostesses who mattered. It had meant carriages that arrived on time, gowns that arrived from Paris, and a house on Belgrave Square that smelled of fresh flowers in every season, because fresh flowers were the kind of thing that families like the Hartwells simply had. That was before the debts. That was before Lord Edmund Hartwell had quietly, methodically, and with no apparent awareness of what he was doing, borrowed against every asset the family possessed, invested poorly in 3 separate ventures that collapsed before they were fully formed, and then died of a fever in the autumn, leaving Victoria to discover the full and terrible shape of the ruin he had left behind. He had not told her. That was the part she could not forgive, even now, 4 years on. He had not told her, and she had spent those 4 years moving through London society with a smile precisely calibrated to suggest that nothing had changed, that the flowers were still fresh, that the carriages were still prompt, that the Hartwell name still meant something, and all of it held together by a single fragile, quietly desperate plan. Her daughter, her eldest daughter, Evelyn. Evelyn Margaret Hartwell was 23 years old. She was not the beauty her mother had hoped for, which was something Victoria had never said aloud, but had communicated in 100 other ways across 100 social seasons. She was tall. She was pale in the particular way of women who spent too much time reading near windows. She had her father's dark eyes and her grandmother's tendency to say exactly what she thought at moments when it would have been considerably more useful to say nothing. She had been presented at court at 17, had navigated 3 full seasons without an acceptable offer, and had watched her mother's smile grow tighter and more fixed with every passing year, like a painting left too long in the sun. She knew about the debts. She had known for 2 years. She had found the letters in her father's study during a quiet afternoon when her mother was out, and she had read them with the steady, careful attention of a person who had long suspected that the world they were living in was made of paper and was now confirming it. She had not told her mother that she knew. She had simply gone on, attending the dinners and the garden parties and the charity concerts and the dreadful balls where her mother positioned her near eligible men with the studied casualness of a chess player moving a piece, and Evelyn had stood in her carefully selected gowns, which were always 1 season behind the fashion because 1 season behind was what they could actually afford, and she had smiled the smile her mother required and said the things that were expected, and none of it had produced what her mother needed. Which was why, on the evening of the 15th of October, Lady Victoria Hartwell had invited Evelyn into the drawing room and told her about Lord Cedric Blackwood. If you have ever felt trapped by expectations that were never yours to begin with, stay with this story, because it is entirely for you. Lord Cedric Blackwood was 51 years old. He was wealthy in the way that certain men are wealthy, which is to say comprehensively, deliberately, and without any particular warmth. He had made his money in shipping and in property, and he had made more of it by knowing precisely when to acquire things and precisely when to discard them. And he had developed, over 51 years of conducting himself in this manner, a view of the world in which everything and everyone was an asset to be evaluated and positioned. He had been married once before. His first wife, a quiet woman from a respectable Shropshire family, had died 11 years ago under circumstances that were spoken of only in careful, sideways language at the kinds of dinner tables where such things were discussed. He had not remarried. He had not needed to. He was not, in the conventional sense of the word, looking for love. He was looking for the particular combination of youth, pedigree, and compliance that made a second wife useful, and Lady Victoria's daughter appeared on the surface to offer all 3. He had made his offer through an intermediary, as men of his type tended to do. The financial arrangement was clear. The Hartwell debts would be settled in full. The house on Belgrave Square would remain in Victoria's name for the duration of her life. A quarterly allowance, generous by the standards of the current situation, would be established. In exchange, Evelyn would become Lady Blackwood within the year, and whatever opinions she held about that arrangement were considered, in the terms of the offer, irrelevant. Lady Victoria had presented this to her daughter the way one presents a solution, not a question. She had used the word opportunity. She had used the phrase suitable match. She had spoken at some length about sacrifice and family, and the things a daughter owed to the name she had been born into. Evelyn had listened to all of it with the particular stillness she had developed over years of being listened to without being heard, and when her mother finished, she said, quietly and without drama, that she would not do it. Victoria's smile had not changed. She had simply looked at her daughter the way a woman looks at a problem she has decided to solve by other means. She had said, "We will speak about this again," and then she had left the room, and Evelyn had sat alone in the drawing room while the fire burned low, and she had thought about what it meant to be owned, and whether the ownership that Cedric Blackwood was offering was in any material way different from the ownership she had already lived under her entire life. She did not cry. She had passed the age of crying about things her mother did. She sat very still and she thought, and she did not yet know what she was going to do, but she knew with the specific certainty of a person who has finally reached a point they cannot step back from, that she was not going to marry Lord Cedric Blackwood. It was 3 days after this conversation that Evelyn saw Ethan Reed for the first time. The occasion was a dinner party at the home of Mrs. Sophia Ravenscroft, a woman who collected interesting people the way others collected porcelain, and whose guest lists therefore produced strange and sometimes uncomfortable combinations of society and talents that her more traditional peers considered improper, and her less traditional peers considered the only worthwhile evenings in London. The house was beautiful in the specific way of houses owned by women with taste and independent income, which is to say warmly and without apology. There were flowers that had been chosen rather than simply arranged. There were paintings on the walls that had been selected for love rather than value. The food was excellent and the wine was better, and by 9 o'clock the rooms were full of conversation that had not yet curdled into performance. Evelyn had come because her mother had insisted, and because Lord Cedric Blackwood was expected to be in attendance, and Victoria had felt that proximity might shift her daughter's resistance into something more manageable. Evelyn had stood near the tall windows of the main salon for most of the first hour, holding a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that she privately considered one of the few good decisions the last season had produced, and watching the room with the alert, slightly detached attention she had learned to deploy at events where she was expected to perform. She had spoken to 3 people. She had smiled at several more. She had successfully avoided Cedric Blackwood for 45 minutes by the simple method of moving in the opposite direction whenever she saw him approaching, which required a particular kind of spatial awareness that she had spent years developing. And then she had moved toward the tall windows at the end of the salon, partly to breathe the cooler air from the garden, and partly because the window offered a clear view of the street below, and it was there, through the glass, that she saw him. He was standing near the servants' entrance, half in shadow, in the kind of clothing that declared his position immediately and without ambiguity: a working coat, dark with wear, heavy boots, the hands of a man who worked with them. He was, by the measures that the room Evelyn was standing in used to measure such things, entirely invisible, a member of the invisible labor that kept the evenings of the visible world running without interruption. except that he was not doing anything that might be expected of someone in his position. He was crouched down near the base of the steps, and in his hands he held something, and Evelyn moved slightly closer to the glass to see what it was. It was bread, torn into pieces, held out with complete patience to a small, thin dog that had appeared from somewhere in the shadows of the adjacent alley, one of the city's innumerable strays, ribby and cautious, and regarding the offered food with the careful suspicion of an animal that had been tricked before. The man did not move. He simply waited, hand extended, completely still, until the dog came close enough to take the piece from his fingers. And then he offered another, and another. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching. He did not perform the gesture for any audience. He was simply a man giving food to a hungry animal in the dark, without an audience, without any expectation of return, because the dog was hungry and the bread was available, and that, apparently, was sufficient reason. Evelyn stood at the window and watched this for longer than she could have explained to anyone. Around her, the party continued. The champagne glasses caught the light. Someone laughed too loudly near the fireplace. Cedric Blackwood moved through the room with the proprietary ease of a man surveying something he expected to acquire. And Evelyn stood at the window, looking at a man she had never met, who did not know she existed, who would almost certainly never enter the room she was standing in, and she felt something shift in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Not attraction, not yet. Something quieter and more fundamental than that. She felt the specific ache of recognizing something real. She had spent 3 seasons in rooms exactly like this one, surrounded by people performing the careful theater of social ambition, and she had almost forgotten, in the relentlessness of it, that there existed in the world moments of pure and uncalculated kindness. Moments that were done not because they were advantageous, or observed, or likely to be remembered, but simply because they were the right thing, and someone had decided to do them. She did not know his name. She did not know who he was or what had brought him to the steps of Mrs. Ravenscroft's house on this particular evening. She only knew, with the simple certainty of someone who had been surrounded by falseness for long enough to recognize its opposite, that whatever that man was, he was genuine. She turned away from the window. She did not speak to Cedric Blackwood for the rest of the evening, and when her mother raised the question again in the carriage home, Evelyn looked at the dark streets passing beyond the window and said, without heat but with absolute finality, that her answer had not changed. Victoria's answer to absolute finality was to remove the variables. Within the week, she had spoken to the solicitors and confirmed what Evelyn already knew, which was that the family had approximately 4 months before the debts reached a stage that could no longer be managed. She had shown Evelyn the letters. She had been very specific about the numbers. She had named the house on Belgrave Square and the staff who would lose their positions and the particular variety of social destruction that would follow a family of their name becoming publicly insolvent. She had not cried. Victoria did not cry. She had simply laid it all out with the methodical thoroughness of a woman deploying the most powerful weapon in her arsenal, which was the truth, carefully framed to produce a specific result. And then she had given Evelyn 1 week. 1 week to reconsider, or the arrangements with Cedric Blackwood would proceed without her consent. She had used the word without her consent in a tone that suggested she did not consider this an unusual or troubling condition. Evelyn spent the first 2 days of that week being very calm. She managed the house. She read. She walked in the gardens of the square in the grey October mornings and thought with the careful, systematic attention she brought to problems that required solving. She thought about Lord Cedric Blackwood and the way he moved through rooms. She thought about the 11 years since his first wife's death and the sideways language used at dinner tables. She thought about the drawing room of the house on Belgrave Square, which her mother had stopped buying fresh flowers for 3 seasons ago, because fresh flowers were the kind of thing that families like the Hartwells simply no longer had. And on the third day, she stopped being calm and started making inquiries. She needed one thing. She needed to know the name of the man who had fed the stray dog on the steps of Mrs. Ravenscroft's house. This was considerably more difficult than it sounds, because asking for the name of a servant present at a dinner party was not the kind of question one could frame to a hostess without generating the specific variety of interest that Evelyn did not want generated. She went around it carefully. She mentioned the party to her friend Clara Vane, who knew Mrs. Ravenscroft, and asked, in the course of a conversation about several other things, whether any of the evening's arrangements had been unusual. Clara, who was observant in the way that women who have learned to listen to what is not said often are, had mentioned that she believed there had been some kind of delivery arranged through the servants' entrance involving a man named Reed, a day labourer known to Mrs. Ravenscroft's housekeeper, who sometimes helped with larger events and lived in the Sparrow Street district. She had said this without particular emphasis. Evelyn had received it without particular emphasis, and 2 days later, she had taken a cab to Sparrow Street. It was not the part of the city she had been raised to visit. The streets were narrow and loud with the specific industry of people who worked with their hands and their bodies, and did not have the leisure of silence. The buildings were close and practical, their facades honest in the way that buildings are when they have never been asked to impress anyone, only to shelter them. Children ran between the carts. Women stood talking at doorways. A man was mending something on the steps of a building that seemed to be quietly winning a slow argument with the ground beneath it. Evelyn sat in the cab, with her gloves folded in her lap, and the very clear awareness that she was either about to do something extremely sensible or extremely foolish, and that the difference between the two was not yet apparent. She found Ethan Reed at a woodyard 3 streets back from the main road. He was stacking timber with the efficiency of someone for whom the work was long familiar, his coat off despite the cold, his attention entirely on the task. She recognized him immediately, not from any detail of his face, which she had not clearly seen through the window of Mrs. Ravenscroft's salon, but from something in the way he moved, the same unhurried steadiness she had watched from above, the same quality of being entirely present in whatever he was doing without apology or performance. She got out of the cab, she walked across the yard. He looked up when she was close enough that ignoring her would have required deliberate effort. He looked at her with dark eyes that were calm and direct and betrayed, in the first instant, neither recognition nor wariness, simply attention. She introduced herself. She said she had seen him at a party 3 weeks before. She said she knew this was extremely irregular. He agreed that it was, without particular alarm. She told him that she needed his help with something important, and that she was aware she had no right to ask for it, but that she was going to ask anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a person looks when they are deciding something that cannot be undone once it is decided, and then he said, "Tell me what it is. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one are exactly what we are here for, and you will not want to miss what comes next." What it was, she explained, was this. She needed to be married. She needed to be married before the end of the month to a man who was not Lord Cedric Blackwood, in a ceremony that was legal and binding and could not be undone by her mother's will, or her family's creditors, or any of the particular machinery that Lady Victoria Hartwell had been assembling for the past 4 years. She was not asking for love. She was not asking for permanence, or at least not without his full understanding of what that word meant and what she was offering in return for it. She was asking for a contract between 2 people who had each, in their different ways, arrived at a situation where the usual paths had closed, and who might, if they were both willing to be honest about what they needed, find a use for each other that served them both. She had prepared for several responses. She had prepared for refusal, which she considered the most likely. She had prepared for laughter, which she considered possible. She had prepared for anger or incomprehension or the particular discomfort of a man who has been asked something so far outside the ordinary that his entire expression rearranges itself around it. She had not prepared for the response she actually received, which was a long silence followed by a single question. He asked her whether she understood what she was proposing, not the mechanics of it, but the reality. Whether she understood that if she did this, she would be stepping outside everything her life had been built around, and that there was no clear map for where she would end up, and that the man she was proposing to involve herself with was not going to offer her the drawing rooms and the society dinners and the kind of life her name suggested she was entitled to. She said she did understand that. She said, furthermore, that the drawing rooms and the society dinners were a significant part of what she was trying to get away from. He looked at her again. It was not an unkind look. It was the look of a person recognizing something in another person that they had not expected to find, and taking a moment to account for it. And then he said, "I have conditions." She said she expected that he would. He said the marriage would be a formal legal arrangement. He said he would not deceive her, and he expected the same in return. He said she would have to live as he lived, which was plainly and without excess, and she would have to manage that without complaint, or she would make both of them miserable. And he said that he did not know what came after, for either of them, but that he was willing to begin if she was. She had not cried then either. She had extended her hand, and he had looked at it for a moment, and then he had taken it, and they had shaken hands in the middle of a woodyard in Sparrow Street in the cold October air, and that was how Evelyn Hartwell agreed to marry a stranger to escape her own life. They were married 4 days later. The church was small. It was in a part of the city that Evelyn's mother would not have found without assistance, and Evelyn had made very certain that assistance would not be available. The witnesses were a woman named Mrs. Alice Whitmore, who ran the lodging house where Ethan lived and who had the steady, unshockable quality of someone who has seen enough of life to find most of it unremarkable, and a boy of about 12 called Oliver, who appeared to belong to nobody in particular and everybody in general, and who regarded the proceedings with the frank interest of a child who has been asked to stand quietly, and has decided that standing quietly does not preclude paying close attention. The ring was plain silver. It was not new. Evelyn did not ask about it. The ceremony was brief in the way of ceremonies that are being conducted for practical rather than ceremonial reasons, and when it was done, the minister shook their hands with the warmth of a man who has married people in every conceivable state of emotion and has long since learned not to read too much into any of them. Evelyn stood on the steps of the church in the pale autumn light and felt the particular sensation of a person who has done something irreversible and is in the process of deciding whether it was brave or catastrophic and has not yet reached a conclusion. Ethan stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and that, she was beginning to notice, was a quality he had in considerable measure. They walked back through the Sparrow Street district together, and she carried one small bag because she had packed what she could take without her mother seeing it disappear, and she thought about the house on Belgrave Square that she had just walked away from, and her mother's face when she discovered the certificate, and Lord Cedric Blackwood's response when informed that the acquisition had been removed from the market. And she thought about the man walking beside her, this quiet, steady, entirely unknown man who had agreed to marry her in a small church for reasons she did not fully understand, and whose name she had known for less than a week, and she thought, well, she had made her choice. Now she would have to learn what it meant. The rooms in Sparrow Street were on the second floor of Mrs. Whitmore's lodging house. 2 rooms and a small kitchen that looked out over a courtyard where someone kept chickens and someone else kept a collection of items that defied clear categorization. They were clean. They were simple. They were smaller than the bedroom Evelyn had slept in at Belgrave Square by a considerable margin, and warmer than it by an equally considerable margin. Because the Sparrow Street lodging house had fires that were kept going as a matter of practical necessity rather than aesthetic comfort, and there was something, she found, in that distinction that she had not expected to find comforting. Mrs. Whitmore showed her where things were with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a woman who has run a lodging house for 15 years and has learned not to make assumptions about the people who arrive at her door. She showed her the kitchen and explained what was available and what was not. She showed her the washroom arrangements and the timing of hot water. She showed her where the extra blankets were kept and mentioned, in passing, that the third step of the back staircase creaked and the first step did not, which detail Evelyn filed with the instinct of someone storing practical information. Oliver appeared twice during this orientation, the second time with a slightly battered apple which he offered to Evelyn with the generosity of a child who is not entirely certain of the social protocol, but has decided generosity is unlikely to be wrong, and which Evelyn accepted with the sincerity of someone who has not eaten since morning and is grateful for it regardless of its provenance. Ethan moved through all of this with the ease of a man in familiar territory. He spoke to Mrs. Whitmore with the comfortable directness of long acquaintance. He ruffled Oliver's hair in passing, with the casual affection of a man who does small kindnesses without keeping score of them. He showed Evelyn the small things of their immediate life, where his books were, which of them she could read without asking, the particular arrangement of the kitchen that he had arrived at through trial rather than design, the single window that looked out toward the rooftops, and, on a clear day, a thin slice of the grey London sky. He did not apologize for any of it. She noticed that particularly. He showed her his life without explanation or qualification, as though it were simply what it was, and she could take it or leave it, and either response was her own business. She thought about all the things her mother would have said about these 2 rooms. She thought about the fresh flowers that the house on Belgrave Square no longer had. She looked at the window with its view of the rooftops and the grey slice of sky, and she thought, I can live here. She was not certain yet of what that meant, but she was fairly certain it was true. The first week in Sparrow Street was an education in the specific variety of humility that comes not from being told. You know nothing but from discovering it yourself, one small failure at a time. Evelyn had been taught many things. She had been taught French and watercolor, and the correct way to address an earl in writing, and the incorrect way to address a viscount in person, and how to enter a room so that the right people noticed, and how to leave one so that the wrong people did not. She had been taught the management of a large household by observation and instruction, which is to say she understood the theory of it entirely, and the practice of it not at all. She had never lit a fire from scratch. She had never boiled water with any particular attention to what water boiling required. She had never bought food at a market where the prices were not fixed by the assumption of a certain kind of customer, and she had discovered on her first attempt that the women of Sparrow Street, who conducted this transaction every morning, did so with a speed and assurance born of long practice, and she had been considerably slower, had paid slightly more than she should have for a cabbage, and had been told so by the woman behind her in the queue, with a frankness that was, when Evelyn thought about it afterward, more useful than most of the instruction she had received in her life. Mrs. Whitmore helped in the manner of a woman who helps without making the help obvious, which was the kind of help that did not require gratitude, and therefore did not produce the particular uncomfortable imbalance that gratitude sometimes created between people who were not equals in the conventional sense, but who were. Evelyn was beginning to understand, equals in every sense that actually mattered. Oliver helped too, differently, in the manner of a child who helps by being enthusiastically present and who communicated information about the neighborhood, its rhythms and its people and its unwritten arrangements, with the accuracy of someone for whom the street was a native language. He told her which stalls had the freshest bread, and which fishmonger had a tendency to describe fish as fresher than it was, and which of Mrs. Whitmore's other lodgers could be trusted and which had a habit of borrowing things and calling it generosity. He told her all of this with the complete confidence of someone whose knowledge is current and precise, and she received it with the gratitude of someone who needs current and precise knowledge, and is not too proud to take it from a 12-year-old who offers it freely. Ethan left early and returned late. The work was at the woodyard and at the docks, and at wherever the day produced for a man who was available for labor and reliable enough that availability meant work. He came home tired in the way of people who use their bodies rather than their minds for their living, and ate with the unhurried appetite of someone for whom hunger is not a metaphor but a fact, and spoke in the evenings without apparent effort or performance, which she had discovered was rarer than it should have been. He asked about her days without the quality of asking that expects a certain kind of answer. He listened when she spoke with the attention of someone to whom listening was a genuine activity, rather than the pause between his own sentences. She told him about the cabbage. He did not laugh at her, which was what she had expected, or offer advice she had not asked for, which was what she had feared. He simply said that the woman behind her in the queue was called Mrs. Hennessy, and that she was, in his experience, right about most things and completely incorrect about one specific matter concerning her neighbor's fence, and that her directness was therefore a quality, and not an insult. Evelyn thought about that for a moment, and then said that she found it, on reflection, more useful than most of the instruction she had received in her life. He had looked at her with something in his expression that she could not quite name, a kind of quiet recognition, and said, "Yes, that sounds right." She had not expected to find him interesting. She had expected to find him decent, because the evidence of the dog and the bread and the general quality of his conduct toward Mrs. Whitmore and Oliver and the world as he moved through it had established decency as a reasonable working assumption. She had not prepared herself for the discovery that decency was only the surface of him. There were books in the 2 rooms that she began, with his permission, to read, and they were not the books of a man whose education had stopped where his circumstances suggested it should have. There was Plato, there was Shakespeare, a well-worn edition with margins that had been written in with ink that had faded to a pale brown, comments and questions and occasional single words that she read with the particular attention of someone in the margins of a book that belonged to another person, and knowing they were reading something intimate. There was history and philosophy and 2 volumes of correspondence by a man whose name she did not immediately recognize, and when she mentioned this to Ethan one evening, he had spoken about the writing for 20 minutes with the ease and specificity of someone to whom this was not a performed interest but a genuine one, and she had sat and listened and tried to reconcile the man she was listening to with every assumption she had carried about who he was and where he had come from, and found that the reconciliation kept failing. He was not what she had thought. She could not yet say what he was instead. But the question, she found, was one she was increasingly interested in pursuing. If you are enjoying this story, this is exactly the moment to like this video, because the best part is still ahead of you, and you will want the algorithm to know you were here. It was in the 3rd week that the letters began. The first arrived on a Tuesday, addressed in her mother's hand, which Evelyn recognized the way one recognizes the handwriting of anyone who has corresponded with you across a lifetime of being managed. She read it. standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window. It was not a warm letter. Victoria did not write warm letters. It was precise and it was comprehensive, and it was framed with the skill of a woman who had spent decades understanding exactly how to arrange words to produce the maximum effect, as a description of everything Evelyn had destroyed. The marriage was described as a disgrace. The choice of partner was described in terms that said nothing specific and implied everything. The effect on the family's social position was detailed in full. The solicitor had confirmed, Victoria wrote, that the marriage was legal and could not be immediately undone. She used the word immediately with the emphasis of a woman who intended to revisit it. Lord Cedric Blackwood had been informed. Lord Cedric Blackwood's response had been, the letter implied, not entirely rational. The letter ended with the statement that Evelyn had made her choice and must live with its consequences, which was framed not as acceptance but as a threat. Evelyn folded the letter. She set it on the kitchen table. She stood for a moment looking at it, and then she put water on to boil for tea and went on with her morning, because the letter said what she had known it would say, and had nothing in it that required anything of her except, perhaps, the decision not to be undone by it. There were more letters. One from her mother's solicitor, formal and careful, and carrying beneath its careful language the suggestion that the matter was not concluded. One from a cousin she barely knew, full of the particular concern of a person who has been instructed to express concern by someone else. One, unexpectedly, from a woman she had considered a friend, which said the right things in the wrong way and which Evelyn read twice, and then did not reply to. Because a letter that said the right things in the wrong way was more difficult to answer than a letter that simply said the wrong things. Ethan saw the letters accumulating on the table. He did not ask about them immediately, which she had noticed was his way, to allow space for information to be offered rather than extracted. It was only one evening, when she had been sitting with one of them for longer than was useful, that he asked simply whether she needed to deal with anything that required his involvement. She told him about her mother. She told him about Lord Cedric Blackwood. She told him the parts she had not told him before the wedding, which she had summarized then as a situation requiring resolution, and which she now described with more completeness, because she had decided that the contract between them had been based on honesty, and that honesty meant the whole shape of the thing, not just the parts that presented well. He listened with his full attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked two questions, one about the solicitor's specific language and one about Blackwood's reputation in the city. And both questions were the questions of someone who was thinking practically and specifically rather than reacting emotionally. And something about that quality, its steadiness and its lack of performance, made her feel, for the first time since the morning, she had found the letters in her father's study and understood the shape of the ruin, that she was not handling something difficult alone. She did not this, but she thought it, and the thought had weight in it that she had not expected. Lord Cedric Blackwood did not write letters. He was not a man who communicated through correspondence when he could communicate through action, and within the month he had communicated through two specific actions. The first was a visit to the Hartwell solicitors, in which he had made it clear that he considered himself wronged in a manner that had financial implications, and that he expected those implications to be addressed. The second was the arrival, on a Wednesday evening, of two men at the corner of the Sparrow Street district, who were not from the neighborhood, and who were conducting themselves with the specific quality of stillness that people who are paid to find things out conduct themselves when they are in the process of finding them out. Ethan saw them before Evelyn did. He said nothing about it immediately, but his manner changed in the way of a person adjusting to new information, not anxious, not dramatic, simply shifting into a different kind of attention. That evening he told her that they were going to have to leave London for a time. He said it without explanation and without apology. He said that he knew a place they could go and that it was safe, and that she would have to trust him on this until he could explain it more fully. She looked at him. She thought about the margin notes in the philosophy books. She thought about the questions he had asked about Cedric Blackwood's reputation, which were not the questions of a day labourer, not the shape of them or the precision of them. She thought about a dozen small things she had been collecting without consciously collecting them. The way he spoke to the solicitor's language, as though it were familiar rather than foreign. The way he understood certain social mechanisms with an intimacy that observation alone could not produce. The particular quality of his stillness in certain situations, which was not the stillness of a man who had learned to make himself invisible, but the stillness of a man who had chosen to. She thought all of this, and then she said, "All right." They left on a Thursday before dawn. Mrs. Whitmore made tea without comment. Oliver stood in the doorway of the lodging house with the expression of a child who is managing something difficult with the tools available to him, and Evelyn crouched down to his level and told him he was the best informant she had ever had, which was, as she told it, completely true. He gave her the remaining portion of a bag of slightly stale biscuits for the journey, which she accepted with complete sincerity, and then they walked to the street where Ethan had arranged a carriage, a modest one, unremarkable, which was not the kind of carriage a day labourer from Sparrow Street could have arranged without means that Sparrow Street did not provide. And Evelyn got in without saying anything about it because they were moving. And this was not the moment. The road was long. The first day took them north through the thinning outskirts of the city and into the wide, low country beyond it, and the second day continued north and east through hills that grew larger and more dramatic as the hours passed, and the third day they descended through autumn woodland into a valley that opened like a hand, and at the end of a long approach road flanked by oak trees whose leaves had turned entirely to gold, there was a house. There was not, in fact, a house. There was an estate. It was vast in the specific way of old English estates, which is to say, it had the confidence of something that has existed for a very long time and fully intends to go on existing. Stone the color of pale honey, 3 full floors of tall windows, wings extending to either side of a central entrance that had a portico of 4 columns and a set of steps broad enough for a considerable gathering. There were gardens visible at the east side, formally arranged and extending to a wall beyond which something larger and less formal began. There were stable buildings and outbuildings, and a glass house that caught the morning light with a brightness that suggested regular care. The whole of it sat in the valley, with the ease of something that had grown there rather than been placed, as though the landscape had arranged itself around it by mutual agreement. Evelyn had been looking out the carriage window as they descended toward it, and she had been quiet for the last mile, and she had not said anything, and then the carriage had turned through the iron gates at the end of the approach road and proceeded up the drive. And the gates had been opened, which meant someone had been expecting them, and the house had grown larger as they approached in the way that very large houses do, which is a way that cannot be entirely prepared for even when you have been watching it approach for several minutes. She turned to look at Ethan. He was watching the house with an expression she could not read, and then the carriage stopped and the door opened, and before she had time to say anything, before she had time to form the question that had been assembling itself in pieces across 3 days and 700 miles, the front doors of the estate house opened, and a line of staff descended the broad stone steps in an orderly and clearly practiced manner, and the woman at the head of them, a housekeeper of considerable bearing, took one look at the man stepping down from the carriage and curtsied. And then they all curtsied or bowed, every single one of them, a wave of deference moving down the steps like something choreographed, and someone said, in a voice of complete and settled calm, "Welcome home, Your Grace." Evelyn stood on the drive in the autumn morning and heard those two words, and felt the specific sensation of the ground reorganizing itself beneath her feet. She turned. She looked at the man she had married in a small church 4 weeks ago, with a plain silver ring and 2 witnesses, and a cracked arrangement of practical necessity. She looked at the man who had stacked timber in a woodyard and lived in 2 rooms in Sparrow Street, and eaten the food she had failed to cook without complaint, and answered questions about philosophy with the ease of genuine familiarity. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, and his expression had changed, not into something unrecognizable. It was still him, still the specific quality of steadiness and directness she had been living beside for a month. But the thing he had been carrying quietly, the thing she had been assembling in pieces without knowing she was assembling it, was now simply visible. He said, before she could speak, "I owe you an explanation." She said yes. She said it very quietly and very clearly, and with a completeness that left no room for misunderstanding. He said, "I know. Come inside." They went inside. The house was enormous and warm and very well managed, and the staff moved through it with the practiced efficiency of a household that had been maintained without its principal in residence for a significant period, and was entirely prepared to resume normal operations. She was shown to rooms that were not 2 rooms and a small kitchen. She was shown to rooms that had a fireplace and a sitting area, and a bedroom of considerable proportion, and a view from the east window of the formal gardens, and beyond them the valley, and everything in them was clean and prepared and waiting. She stood in the middle of the sitting room of these rooms in the coat she had worn for 3 days of traveling, and looked at the fireplace, where a fire had already been lit, and thought about the lodging house in Sparrow Street, and the creak on the 3rd step of the back staircase, and Mrs. Whitmore's unshockable efficiency, and Oliver's biscuits, and the 2 rooms above the courtyard with the chickens, and she felt something complicated move through her that was not quite grief, and not quite anger, and not quite relief, and was, she thought, probably all 3 at once. And then she sat down in the chair nearest the fire, because she had been traveling for 3 days, and she was tired, and she waited for the explanation she had been told she was owed. He came an hour later. He came without servants and without ceremony. He sat down across from her, and he looked at her with the dark eyes that had been steady and direct since the first morning in the woodyard, and he told her his name, his real name. Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ravenshire. He told it to her without embellishment and without the kind of managed delivery that people use when they are telling a story they have prepared. He told it the way a person tells something true that they have been carrying for a long time and are now setting down. Sebastian Ashford. The estate was Ravenshire. The staff who had curtsied on the steps had served the Ashford family for 4 generations, and he had known them by name since childhood. He had not been born Ethan Reed. He had not grown up in Sparrow Street. He had grown up here, in this valley, in this house, with all of this, with the weight and the privilege and the obligation of all of this, and he had walked away from it 2 years ago, changed his name, and gone to London to work with his hands in a wood yard, and nobody outside of the 3 people on earth he trusted absolutely had known where he was. She listened to all of this. She listened without interruption, with the careful attention she brought to things that required understanding, and when he finished, she sat for a moment in silence. And then she asked him why. He was quiet. It was the first time since she had known him that his stillness felt different from all his other silences, less like choice and more like something being held back by effort. And then he said her name, not Evelyn. A name she did not know, Isabella. He said it once, the way you say the names of people who are gone, quietly, and with the particular care of someone handling something breakable. Isabella Ashford. His wife. She had died 2 years ago in this house in the winter, of an illness that had moved faster than any of them had expected, and had left him with nothing to hold on to except the estate he had been born to manage and the grief of a man who had loved genuinely and lost entirely, and did not know, afterward, what he was supposed to do with the person he still was. He had tried. He had tried in the ways that men of his position try. He had attended to the estate and the tenants and the parliamentary obligations and the social requirements, and he had done all of it correctly, and none of it had reached him. None of it had made any difference to the thing inside him that had gone completely dark. He had left on a Tuesday morning in February. He had taken a bag with what he needed and walked out through the kitchen entrance and gone north and then south, and eventually to London, to Sparrow Street, to a room in Mrs. Whitmore's lodging house and a job at the Woodyard, and he had spent 2 years being Ethan Reed, working, living simply, helping Oliver with his letters and talking to Mrs. Whitmore about the practical running of things, and reading in the evenings and feeding the stray dogs that came through the alleyways. And none of it had been dramatic, and none of it had been particularly interesting, and all of it had been, slowly and without announcement, bearable. He had been in the process of becoming, he said, something he could live with again. And then she had walked across the Woodyard in her blue coat and asked him to marry her. Evelyn sat with all of this for a long time. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult things, not rushing toward a response, letting it settle into its full shape. She thought about the books with the margin notes. She thought about the questions about the solicitor's language. She thought about the way he moved through the lodging house, the ease of a man who had managed large households, the ease of a man who knew what management looked like because he had been the subject of it. She thought about the plain silver ring, which was not new, which had not been explained, and which she now understood was not from a day labourer's savings. She thought about the small, genuine kindnesses, the dog, the bread, Oliver's letters, Mrs. Whitmore's deference, which she had thought was the deference of a landlady toward a reliable tenant, and which she now understood was something else entirely. She thought about all of it, and then she said what she was actually feeling, because she had decided before any of this began that honesty was the contract, and she was going to hold to it, regardless of how uncomfortable it was. She said that she felt deceived. She said it without heat. She said it the way you say something true that you are not trying to use as a weapon, but simply need the other person to know is true. She said that she had agreed to a life she understood, and had been living it genuinely, and had been in the process of discovering something real in it, and that the discovery that the foundation of it was not what it appeared to be was not a small thing, and she needed him to know that. He said yes. He said it without defense or qualification. He said she was right. He said that he had not told her because at the beginning he had not trusted the situation enough to tell anyone. And then later, when he had begun to trust her specifically, he had not known how to introduce it into the life they were living without destroying what had begun to exist between them, and that he recognized that both reasons, while true, were forms of cowardice, and he was sorry for them. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about her mother's letters and the way they were crafted to produce specific effects, and she thought about the difference between that and what she was looking at now. A man sitting across from her saying something difficult without dressing it up, and she thought that whatever she was going to do with everything she had just been told, she was not going to do it quickly or in the first hour. She said she needed time to think. He said, "Of course." He said the house was hers for as long as she needed it, that he would not press her for anything, that she could have whatever space she required. And she believed him. She did not know quite what to do with believing him, given the context, but she believed him, and that was something. She stayed. The days that followed were not simple, but they were interesting, and Evelyn had long since learned that interesting was more sustaining than simple. The house was extraordinary in ways she discovered gradually, like reading a long book with the patience to let it open itself. The glass house had been designed by someone who understood both botany and light, and it held plants from 4 different climates in a carefully managed balance that she had spent 3 afternoons learning the outlines of, with the help of a gardener named Pearson, who had the manner of a man deeply suspicious of enthusiasts, but willing to be converted by evidence. The library had 12,000 volumes, and a system she eventually understood, and a window that looked south toward the valley and the late autumn sun. And she had established a working relationship with it that felt, within 2 weeks, as natural as the one she had developed with the books in Sparrow Street, which was to say she was entirely comfortable and slightly possessive. The staff watched her with the careful attention of people accustomed to reading a new presence in their household, and she returned it with the attentiveness of someone who has learned that the people who run a house know more about it than anyone who merely lives in it. She learned their names, all of them. She asked questions that were genuine rather than performed, and received answers that were increasingly genuine in return. And by the end of the 2nd week there was a quality of ease in the house that had not been there at the beginning, a small but perceptible warming. The housekeeper, a woman called Mrs. Dorothea Hale, told her on the 14th day, with the careful indirection of someone saying something significant, while appearing to say something practical, that the glass house had not had anyone in it regularly since before the last Duchess died. She said it while showing Evelyn where the garden tools were kept. She did not expand on it. She did not need to. Sebastian stayed in the house, but gave her the space he had promised, which she found he was genuinely capable of, without the strained quality that most people brought to the attempt. He did not avoid her, which would have been its own kind of message. He was simply present in the ways that were useful and absent in the ways that were not, and when they were in the same room together it had, gradually and without announcement, the quality of 2 people who had lived beside each other for a month already, and knew the particular shape of each other's presence. She had not forgiven the deception, or not entirely. She was in the process of doing something more complicated than forgiving, which was understanding it, placing it in the full context of what she now knew and what she had observed and what she was still learning, and deciding what it meant in the totality of everything, not just in isolation. One evening he found her in the library, at a point where the fire had burned low and she was still reading by the last of its light, and he came in and added wood to the fire without being asked, and sat down at the other end of the room with a book of his own. And they read in the same room for 2 hours without speaking, and it was the most comfortable 2 hours Evelyn had spent in a very long time. Something was growing between them that neither of them had named, because naming it required a kind of trust that had been complicated by discovery and was in the process of being rebuilt on a different foundation, and rebuilding is slower than building the first time and requires more care. But it was growing. She could feel it the way you feel the change in a season before the season has officially changed, in the quality of the light and the temperature of the air and the small shifts in a world that is moving towards something new without yet having arrived. She thought about the woman in the 2 rooms above the courtyard with the chickens who had been learning to buy cabbage and had been told she was paying too much by a woman named Mrs. Hennessy. And she thought about the woman now in a room, in a house in a valley, where the autumn light came through the east window in the mornings. And she thought that both of those women were herself, and that the thread connecting them was the same thread she had been following. Since the evening she stood at a window in Sophia Ravenscroft's salon, and watched a man she did not know give bread to a dog in the dark. She was not yet certain where the thread led, but she was, she thought, finally ready to follow it honestly. And that, she had learned, was where most real things actually began. If this story stayed with you, if you felt every turn of it, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Hit the like button right now, subscribe so the next story finds you, and share this with someone who loves a romance that earns every moment it asks you to believe in. Drop a comment below and tell us, did you see Sebastian's secret coming? Or did Evelyn's strength surprise you more? We read every single one. The next story is coming, and it is worth the wait.